And
Okay,
Joe,
thank you,
take it
Stephen.
away.
Tonight we have Dr. Rubén G. Mendoza speaking to us. The title of his talk is Night of the Night Sun, the Aztec Sun Stone in light of New Fire Ceremony of AD 1507. And first of all, I want to welcome everybody tonight. I'm glad to see so many people logged in. Dr. Mendoza is an archaeologist, a writer, photographer, adventurer, and founding faculty member of the Cal State University Monterey Bay and the School of Global Studies. He's current president of the board of directors of the Monterey County Historical Society. He has conducted archaeological and ethno-historical investigations at many California missions and at the Spanish Royal Presidio of Monterey, besides his work on Amerindian and Spanish colonial sites. His discovery of the Sierra chapels of 1770 and 1772 advanced his studies into the life and times of Saint Junipero Sierra. He was called to serve as a consultant to the UNESCO World Heritage listing for the San Antonio missions in Texas. He served as a cultural consultant, a photographer, and on-air talent for the production of 1492, The Untold Story of the Americas Before Columbus. His publications span the archaeology, the prehistory, the ethnohistory of the American Hemisphere. Dr. Mendoza has some 250 published articles, chapters, books, including University of Arizona Press editions of both Latin American and North American indigenous warfare and ritual violence. His architectural histories include Rizzoli's The California Missions, the Spanish-style house, and the Casa Santa Fe, Design, Style, Arts, and Tradition, reanalysis of the Aztec Sun Stone entitled War of Heaven, and Mesoamerican Ritual, Human Sacrifice, Recent Findings and New Perspectives. That's the bio that I'm going to read. I had to whittle it down. There's much more in depth, and I invite everybody to go to the website to get more detail on his bio, which is rather extensive. And tonight I want to welcome Dr. Mendoza. It is all yours. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed my last visit with you and the presentation then, and I look forward to any interaction, any questions you may have regarding this reinterpretation of what is typically called the Aztec Calendar stone. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and shift into sharing my PowerPoint. And we can, I might be able to take some questions during the presentation, but my thought is I want to make sure I'm on schedule so that we can reserve questions to the end. And I thank you for your patience. Of course, I would be remiss not to throw in an unpaid political advertisement here. This is a forthcoming book. On the left, you see a mock-up of the cover, which I proposed, but it's actually going to be a standard cover that Springer Press uses. This book should be out in hard copy in time for the New Orleans meetings of the Society for American Archaeology in April. On the right, you see part of the uncorrected proof that I completed last week, all 160 pages. And we have in this volume 18 authors, 15 chapters, and we're able to track the question of ritual human sacrifice in Mesoamerica back to about 9,000 years, based on the archaeological, bioarchaeological, and other evidence. And that particular treatment spans from 9,000 all the way into the present, with animal sacrifice in many indigenous communities of Mesoamerica. So, without further ado, I want to take you now to the presentation, the topic for this evening. I call this Night of the Ninth Sun, Sol Nueve, the Aztec Sun Stone in light of the commemoration of the New Fire Ceremony of AD 1507. And what you see is on the far left an image of Sol Nueve, literally being sacrificed by 9 supernatural beings who are using tecpatl or flint knives in order to cut the basic articular joints of this being. And from every one, they draw blood and they draw light from this blackened being who is, in fact, the 9th sun. In the middle, you see, of course, the Aztec Sun Stone, also more popularly known as the Calendar Stone. And on the right, you see an image from the murals of Desiderio Hernandez Xocoyotzin in Tlaxcala, who depicts the new fire ceremony among the Tlaxcalteca of the state of Tlaxcala. I'll go ahead and read this. Obviously, it's a little presumptuous to be quoting myself, but this kind of got to the point. This is from my publication in 2021. The Aztec Sunstone or Calendar Stone was originally situated before the Templo Mayor, and shortly after the fall of the Aztec capital of Mexico Tenochtitlan in 1521, was moved to the southeast corner of the present-day Zócalo. On the orders of Archbishop Fray Alonso de Montúfar, 1551 to 72, the monument was dislodged and buried upside down, as it was thought to have inspired a resurgence of violence in that locality. On 17 December 1790, the monument was rediscovered and disinterred and relocated at the west elevation of the southwest bell tower of the Metropolitan Cathedral. For those that might be interested, I did forward a copy of the publication cited below. That was The War of Heaven, a reappraisal of the Aztec Sunstone in light of Nahua cosmogenesis and the new fire ceremony of 1507 AD. So if you would like a copy of the article, it gives far more detail than I plan to give here tonight. When we look at the so-called Calendar Stone or Aztec Sunstone, it is a composite of much of the most incredible iconography that was produced by the Mexica Aztec, who generated an empire over the course of little more than a century by conquering rivals throughout the basin of Mexico. And they were the peoples who, of course, we best know for having encountered Hernán Cortés, or I should say Hernán Cortés encountered them and was very impressed with the sophistication of the Mexica Aztec and their empire. It was a well-oiled machine. It was a military juggernaut, but at the same time, what drew the fancy of many, myself included, was the fact of a civilization of this incredible sophistication engaged in a level of sacrifice, ritual human sacrifice, which has been equaled by many civilizations, but in this case, it was systematized in a way that shocked the Spanish, who, let's just say, had engaged in activities that were rather brutal and could be construed as barbaric, and yet they too were shocked by the bloody nature of these sacrificial rituals. The Sunstone has had a rather interesting history, a transit from essentially the area immediately in front of the Templo Mayor, the great temple of the Aztecs, where it sat atop what could be construed as the Sun Temple, right before the main temple of the Aztecs. It was lying flat, and so this face that you see would have been facing upwards. And there have been many books, many articles that have attempted to explain the nature of this monument. And I believe that many of them were on the right track. Many of them kind of went off the rails, and others got so fanciful that it's no longer coherent as a singular interpretation of this monument. And here you see an image from roughly 1885 that's from a transparency, a glass plate slide that I have in my collection. My interest in the Aztecs, as I noted before the talk, began with a trip to Mexico City that began as a political odyssey on the part of my father. And I went to the National Museum, saw the Temple of the Sun, or the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, but it was this monument in particular that drew my attention. This is known as Coatlicue, or snakes per skirt. It weighs over 3 tons, and has been recently reinterpreted to represent one of the Tzitzimime star demons, who was part of this cosmology regarding the birth of Xiuhtlapilli, the sun deity, hummingbird on left. In fact, this was his mother, and here she is depicted as pregnant. But you note that around her neck are severed hands and excised human hearts. Every part of her body is part of a writhing serpent. And again, the cosmology and the significance of this drew my attention when I was in high school. And even though I didn't read Spanish, I learned to read Spanish by picking up Justino Fernandez's book on La Estética del Arte Mexicano, and half the book is devoted to the interpretation of this goddess. In subsequent trips to Mexico City, I became so enamored with this goddess. It might have been because I didn't have any lady friends, but there was a point where I would come in and my ritual was to get to Mexico City, kneel before the monument and kiss her feet. And the guards never bothered me about that, but I was that enthralled with this monument and its sophistication. So much so that ultimately, as an undergraduate, I dove directly into the study of this monument at a site called Malinalco, which is located approximately 125 miles southwest of Mexico City as the crow flies. I first got to this site when I was 17, and this for me was an embodiment of what Coatlicue was. She represented the heavens and the earth. She represented the cosmology of the Aztecs. And what I saw in this monument were depictions of the sun being regurgitated from the mouth of Xiuhtlalpilli, the earth monster, who is depicted, as you see in the lower left image, as a reptilian creature with a bifid tongue. And in the middle of the staircase, which consisted of 13 steps, what you have is a solar deity, or it's been interpreted as such. To the right of each flank of the staircase, you have ocelotl, or jaguars, who are identified with the earth. And then when you get to the summit of the temple, which is circular and carved from the living rock 500 feet up the side of a cliff, you see the Xiuhtlalpilli, these images. Let's see if I can move this bar here. You see in the lower right, the fire serpent with what appear to be flames or arrows coming from the back, literally porting the sun across the heavens. So this was this particular monument was of particular interest. The interior of the rock-cut temple had 3 eagles, or cuatli, and then the ocelotl, or jaguar, on the bench. And it was a U-shaped bench, a circular chamber. And according to the accounts, there were symbols of the sun or fire in those rectangular pegs that you see right above each of these creatures. And at the middle of it was a location that was accounted for as a place in which human hearts were deposited. Ultimately, in studying that monument, I came to the conclusion, and I published an undergraduate paper. My university, Cal State Bakersfield, I entered the paper into a graduate school competition, not realizing I wasn't a graduate student. I was an undergraduate. I submitted it anyway. They rejected it, but then I presented the same paper before the Southwestern Anthropological Association in Santa Fe, and I won the National Graduate Student Award with that paper, got $500. And when I returned to campus, the campus committee that rejected my paper decided to go ahead and give me $500 because they were embarrassed. So, but sometimes embarrassment can lead to rewards. In this particular case, we have some of the earliest accountings or interpretations. For example, Antonio de León y Gama was among the first to publish a scholarly paper in which he saw the utility of looking at the calendrical symbols in this monument. He was among the first to understand that this was an image that signified the sun, and he interpreted it accordingly. His paper published in 1790. So there is now a very long record of scholarship around this monument. When we look at the Aztec Sun Stone, and I do prefer to call it the Sunstone because there's so much more here than calendrical signification. In fact, the monument has often been called a calendar, And I don't dispute the calendrical connotations. I have a number of friends that are very much invested in the calendrical dimensions of this monument. But if you look at the day signs that are included around the perimeter, what you have is that these are actually moving in reverse. And that is one of the key characteristics of this monument, because the deities that I've identified from the Codex Borbonicus or Borgia are depicted in the obverse. And this is significant because when you look at the notion of an underworld, and I do believe that the being at the center is essentially Sol Nueve or Xiuhmolpilli, the Lord of Night, as the night sun. The number 9 recurs in this, but recently a host of scholars have begun to look at the notion of the number 9 as not necessarily signifying Mictlan, the underworld, a land of the dead, but rather that which is above and that which is below. And the way in which the Nahuatlacos, or the Nahua peoples of central Mexico, have envisioned and continue to imagine their cosmos, they believe that essentially we live in the place of light, but the underworld is a mirrored image of the world in which we live, but in darkness. It is a place of mysticism, of that which is supernatural. It is a place where the ancestors alight and where the dead go, but they are among us in both dimensions, both that of light and that of darkness. And when you think about one of the key gods of the pantheon, you come to understand that Tezcatlipoca, the smoke mirror, was one of the ways in which priests would scry, or they would read your future through an obsidian mirror. So think of this as that mirror. Many interpretations have been advanced for the sunstone. Among these, that it was a Temalacatl, or one of those monuments used for the gladiatorial sacrifice, which became renowned among the Aztecs, because the Tlaxcalteca literally were at war with the Aztecs for some 50 to 60 years, and they would capture prisoners, bring them back to Mexico Tenochtitlan. The prisoner, if they were Tlaxcalteca, would be tied with a rope to the Temalacatl, which typically had a hole or some sort of anchor in the middle, and they would be given wooden weapons covered with feathers and a shield, and they would be put upon by up to 5 Aztec warriors bearing obsidian-bladed weapons, which were lethal. And in one such case, one of these Tlaxcaltecans defeated 5 fully armed and clad warriors of the Aztec, and this individual was given his freedom and then made a general in the Mexica military. So it was highly prestigious, but unfortunately, I would argue and contend that the Aztec Sunstone is not a Temalacatl. There are many details, and I, for many years, have seen Mesoamerica as a cosmological whole. And I believe Michael D. Coe, who gave a presentation some years ago that I attended, was attempting to say the same thing. But for many years, when I was at the University of Arizona, because I was a central Mexicanist concerned with the Aztec and the highland peoples identified with a group known as the Olmeca Xicalanga, my professors were very much oriented to the Maya, and they didn't see a connection. They tended to see in the old traditional way that the Aztecs were like the bloody Romans and the Maya were the Greeks of classical origins. And so that stereotype hung on for many years. And I was up against that when I was in grad school. I, however, continue to believe that when we look at the Maya, and now that we can interpret their epigraphic system, we have an open door to interpreting the beliefs and cosmologies of groups like the Mexica and others who are part and parcel of that longer tradition that has very deep roots in places like ancient Teotihuacan, which, as I noted before the presentation, that term has been reinterpreted. No longer do we interpret it as a place where men become gods, which is a bit androcentric, admittedly, but rather it is the place of the sun, Teohuacan, Teotihuacan, the place of the sun. Well, at the base of the so-called Pyramid of the Sun, this monument was recovered some years ago, and it appears to represent, and you could say, well, that looks like a fan nape ornament around the neck. Maybe it's paper. Well, I believe it represents the dead sun, or the sun of night, or Sol Nueve, which has great antiquity in the Central Highlands. And so this monument, I believe, is part of this constellation. When we look at recent interpretations, William Fash, who is a Mayanist who I met at Copan during one of his digs, wrote a paper that really surprised me. You know, he's a staunch Mayanist, but he began to see the connections with the Central Mexicans. And he published a paper in which he interpreted, with the help of people like David Stewart, the translation of a series of texts that indicated that one of the great lords of Copan had traveled for 50 days to the northwest to an ancient city of the sun. And there was basically, he was invested as a king, but as a fire-born lord and as one who bears the Kinich Ahau, or the sun face of the Lord. These are terms central to the Maya, and we now believe that Teotihuacan and the adosada platform in front of the Pyramid of the Sun was in fact the place where a new fire ceremony was conducted for the investiture of kings and queens. So it's not surprising that all of the monuments found at the base of the Pyramid of the Sun are related to the earliest versions of the so-called new fire ceremony on record. And I will define the new fire ceremony here momentarily. In examining the Aztec Sunstone, one of the first impressions that I had, which I thought began to lead me down into the veritable Tochtli hole, or the rabbit hole, and that was that when you look at ball court rings, and I've heard this said commonly, especially by tour guides, that these ball court rings were purportedly a ring through which the player would bat a rubber ball, that I might note was vulcanized, the earliest vulcanization on record. They would bat the ball through there, and it represented the sun's passage into light. And I always thought that was suspicious, given what I now know about the Aztec Sunstone. And when you look at these monuments, what you find is the indication, and I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but right here you see this upturned V-shaped element, which is a Xiuht. A Xiuht is a symbol for turquoise, in turn a symbol for fire, and they're all over the sunstone. They're also on these ball court rings. And I began to think about it. So what I did was I took the image from the top of the Teocalli de la Guerra Sagrada, or the temple stone, and I cut out the center, which had an image of the Olin, which is a four-part symbol representing motion. And I realized this is, in fact, a ball court ring. And yet this is a depiction of the Aztec Sunstone, which is the topic for tonight's presentation. You see literally here, Xiuht, turquoise or fire, interspersed with these elements that are agave thorns, which were used for bloodletting, and they pierce the center as though it was a Xiuhtlalpilli, which is the grass ball of sacrifice used by the priesthood to insert the bloody implements used to draw blood through auto-sacrifice. So if you rethink the Aztec Sunstone as both a ball court ring and as the Xiuhtlalpilli, which is the grass ball of sacrifice and the place from which fire and light emerge, you have a ball court ring. Oh, by the way, I sent my paper to a number of Mesoamerican scholars after it was published back in 2021, now 3 years ago. Among these was Mary Ellen Miller, and Cecilia Klein, and David Stewart. And I got responses from everybody except David Stewart. And then 2 years later, he came out with his own book on the Aztec Sunstone. So I think I don't know if he's even aware of my paper or even received it, but I think we have not necessarily diametrically opposed views on the interpretation, because he doesn't really broach any of the dimensions that I'm dealing with here tonight, but he does see it as a monument to be read as though it were an epigraphic or linguistic text in Nahuatl. And I agree with him on that. Here we see a representation of the actual colors that have been discerned through chemical analysis of this monument. And bear in mind that turquoise or blue is included in the tails of these Xiuhtlalpilli, fire serpents. You note their heads are blue, and then there what appear to be flames running around the perimeter, and then you get to the end. Here you see these ties, which are usually tied around sacrificial stones, suggesting bloodletting. And at the middle, you see the face is darkened. In fact, it's somewhat equivocal because scholars have not yet determined whether or not what remains of blue in the center was not in fact scorched by fire, because they found more black residue on the face of the sunstone, which also appears to have been spalled by virtue of the presence of fire over stone. The other part, which is significant, and I'll come back to this later, is that the body of the monument is yellow for the most part, the same color used to paint the massive monument discovered in Mexico City back in 2010, representing the Earth Lord, Xiuhtlalpilli. So if you can imagine this as the body of the Earth with the sun emerging through a ball court-like disc with images of fire in the form of turquoise, as well as light and bloody thorns. I might note that I had this drawing commissioned by one of my students, Maddie Rapella. She's really quite the artist. She was having to deal with me, so it made it a little more challenging insofar as how to represent details. I was a stickler for it. And I wanted it to come as close to the original drawings based on what we know of the color scheme. So there you have the color scheme, and there you have the image in black and white. At the bottom, we have two beings who have iconography that I'll explain shortly, and they represent two images of cosmological deities central to the notion of fire, the kindling of the new fire ceremony, and basically the investiture of kings and emperors. I might also note that there is a common belief that what the new fire ceremony represents is a period that can only encompass 52 years. I would argue differently, because we now know that while the Aztecs maintained a 52-year count, and they were very specific about this, they even had to alter it when they had a bad year in which the new fire ceremony fell, which was 1454. So they moved it to 1455, thereby changing the entire history of the new fire ceremony in central Mexico. That was the year of famine in which Xiuhtlalpilli ruled. Later, they had to switch to Acatl, and you see the image of the Acatl at the top, which was the new way of designating the new fire ceremony. But what I was going to say is, while the Aztecs construe it, and it is documented as representing and encompassing 52-year cycles and counts, you have to bear in mind that, as noted here, the Mixteca, the peoples of Oaxaca, and many other regions in the highlands conducted fire drills or new fire ceremonies every time someone was invested as a king or as a queen. This was, it was consonant with kingship. And so we have to kind of look beyond the notion of this cosmological cycle of 52 years, realizing you have that one big wheel that turns constantly over 52-year cycles, but then you have the individual fire ceremonies in which fire drills are used to kindle the new fires to represent the new king. So when we look at the turquoise Lord of Fire, in my paper published with Cambridge University Press, basically we were looking at the paper that I published there. In that paper, what I did was I talk about the bifurcation of elite status, or the bifurcation of status in ancient Mesoamerica. Bear in mind that when Teotihuacan was rising to become the ancient city and the metropolis, and likely the empire that it became, especially in terms of its mercantile connections its warring factions, its movement of military across the Mesoamerican landscape. At that time, jade was central to the Maya, to the Olmecs, to the ancestors, essentially, of the peoples of Teotihuacan, and we do find jade there. However, it is clear that with the collapse of places like Copan to Quiriguá, Quiriguá now controlled one of the few places for Mesoamerican jade, the Motagua River. And I contend that when that happened, and Teotihuacan literally sees a rupture at places like Tikal, where all of its Teotihuacan or Mexicanized monuments are smashed, their temples are destroyed, and they are ejected from the region. I believe between 550 and 600, Teotihuacan is literally pushed out of the region that would have given them continued access to jade. And they began moving to the north, and I document this in my dissertation. And what you find is places like Alta Vista suddenly begin drawing on greenstone. We might call this a social jade. It's not true jade. Sometimes it's simply greenish or bluish minerals. And as a result, they are using materials that are do not have the hardness scale of jade, but they still allow the elite to represent themselves with what looks like jade. And it is at that point, at roughly 600, I believe there's a bifurcation. And then you see Alta Vista, Chalchihuites, and Zacatecas produces this material. It comes under attack. The city collapses, and now you see turquoise proliferating out of the American Southwest and other areas. And it begins entering central Mexico, where later the Toltecs begin using turquoise in much of their iconography. And eventually it is adopted for kingship by the line of emperors leading to Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, the final Aztec, or I should say the second to the last Aztec emperor. Here you see what has been interpreted as a judge in one of Diego Rivera's paintings, but you see the crown that Xiuhtlalpilli that he wears on his head as, again, a symbol of royalty. Turquoise was controlled severely. Commoners could not own turquoise. It was controlled by the elite house, the royal house of Moctezuma. And so you don't see it proliferating among the commoners. This particular piece that I photographed at the British Museum is, of course, an outstanding piece of work. This has been studied by the folks at the British Museum, and they have interpreted that although there are other studies out there now claiming that a lot of the turquoise did not come out of the Southwest or did not come from places like the area of Cerrillos near Chaco Canyon, which I visited and photographed. This piece does in fact have Southwest turquoise in it. As to what it signifies, again, a double-headed serpent scepter, literally part of a symbol of kingship that literally circumscribes the Aztec Sun Stone as a two-headed serpent with two different deities emerging from the mouths. I would contend that this, in effect, represents the Xiuhtlalpilli, the fire serpent, and in turn, the Lord of Turquoise. One other thing that, and again, I acknowledge that there are certain dimensions of what I'm talking about that are still speculative because we haven't been able to demonstrate it fully. I believe that these crania, which were recovered from deceased ancestors in elite context, represented fire-born lords. Their faces are covered with turquoise, which in turn signifies the fire or the fire-born lord or the sun-faced lord. When we look at, for example, Xiuhmolpilli, you see here the Xiuhtlalpilli, Tilmatli, Tenishyo, or turquoise-knotted tie cape and border of eyes. You'll note in this element here, you have a stepped fret element, which as a result of a gang study that I did for the Justice Department, they were being sued, the state of California was being sued by a Norteño shot caller at Pelican Bay. And while I sympathized and did not want to be the person to derail his artistic contributions, he was distributing his art to known affiliates. And the government began to connect these to crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors, as we might say in Washington, D.C. And as a result, they needed an Aztec specialist to come in. They asked me to do it. And I went ahead and took the assignment right before I headed to Oaxaca to study under Carl Taube and John Pohl. And of course, I drilled them, so to speak, on different elements of what I saw in the iconography of the gangland art that I was studying. Ultimately, what they didn't tell me was I was up against, a host of different issues, including the expert witness that the Norteño shot caller had on his side was David Carrasco, who's one of the foremost specialists. And we ended up going head to head in reports. And ultimately, and I'm bragging here, but we prevailed. And I was able to shoot down much of what was presented. And as a result, I was able to actually elicit and interpret this symbol, which is used by the Norteños as the water mountain, which in fact is a symbol of cosmological significance. I believe the water mountain signifies each of those kingdoms throughout Mesoamerica, and you find this symbol occurring in those places where you have monumental pyramidal platforms, which I believe are incarnations of the water mountain or the place of sustenance. What do we mean by a semasiographic system? This was something that David Stewart, to his credit, in his book that appeared, I guess it's been over a year ago. In that particular study, he gets into the semasiographic system. And what he's simply saying, and what I said in my earlier paper, is that this represents a constellation of individual elements, when taken together, interpreted variously, have different messages, because you have a conflation of meaning here, but the cosmology is clear. What David Stewart argues is that when looked at, he basically critiques Central Mexicanists as not literally building upon the linguistics of the Nahuatl language and then connecting it with the iconography, as though somehow we're only looking at the iconography without embedding it within its cultural matrix. And I would disagree with that. I believe that there are plenty of us who do that. David Stewart is, in fact, an epigrapher of the Mayan. He does that, brilliantly. I wouldn't argue with that. But I do think that a lot of this is predicated on the understanding of the glyphic systems. When we look at elements, for example, if I go back and, well, you don't see it here, but all around the perimeter, you see the fire serpents, the Xiuhtlapilli. This is a monumental representation of the Xiuhtlapilli. And you'll note that he has a curved upper snout, I guess you could call it. And around this snout, you have stars. These are stellar tenons or eyes, and that have been interpreted as signifying the Pleiades. Also, the significance of this creature has been interpreted as signifying the blue worm. And then more recently, there's been a tendency in the Maya region, and I believe that we may have similar iconographies here, that this may in fact represent a centipede of the type that you get in the southwestern US, the place of turquoise. And there may be a connection there, which I'm still exploring. You see at the lower, let's see if I can move this again. You see in the lower right, one of these creatures. I once stayed in a Maya village, and because there were guerrillas, it was at the end of the Guatemalan Civil War, we were forced to turn back at around midnight. And I was able to get a room in a place with no door, no electricity, no running water. And when I went in, I saw something move next to my hand, and I got my penlight flashlight. It was a spider about the size of my hand. And then I looked around the room, and there were centipedes literally crawling all over the walls, along with scorpions of various sizes, these large spiders. And I realized I am literally in the underworld here. Part of what helped further my study of the Aztec Sunstone as a monument commemorating what I concluded as the new fire ceremony of 1507. Bear in mind that to date, other scholars have not placed a date on that monument because they assume that it must have been done by Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin because his name's on it. But they don't know if that happened at the start of his reign or at the end of his reign. Well, I was able to position it on the date of 1507, and I believe the Aztec Sunstone was created by Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin to commemorate the new fire ceremony of 1507. And another monument, in fact, Moctezuma commissioned a host of monuments just before 1507, including the Temple Stone, otherwise known as the Xiuhtlalpilli de la Guerra Sagrada. This monument is dated to 1507, thereby my interpretation and my correlation of this monument with the Sunstone. A lot of the iconography is identical. And in fact, if you look at the center, you've already seen this representation of what I believe is, in fact, the Aztec Sunstone crafted at the same time. And you have 4 priests around the perimeter signifying the 4 lords identified with the new fire ceremony of that year. On the right, this Tlalpan Huehuetl or earth drum has the iconography that you see on the side here. This is the Atl Tlachinoli, which is a symbol of water and fire. And again, these 2 elements are primordial and they signify the holy war of the Aztecs. Scorched earth, in other words. On the sides of the temple stone, you see this tecpatl, which is basically a flint knife with literally the Atl Tlachinoli, water and fire emerging from it, as well as the smoke mirror, which signifies the scrying mirror used by priests to interpret your fate. It literally emerges from one flint. So when we look at a lot of the symbolism, just to make it a little more clear, you see the Xiuhtl I have here indicated in red. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you might say, well, that's kind of a stretch. Well, you don't see the bases of these Xiuhtl, but I would contend that it is here. It represents both the turquoise symbol as well as the thorn used for blood sacrifice. Over here, the Xiuhmolpilli is represented at the center with literally this crown. And then at the bottom of if you look at this as one piece, this represents the bloodied thorn stuck into the Zacatepolli. And there you see the thorns highlighted in yellow, representing that element. And if you count the 8 and you include the one at the center, again, you have the number 9. Xiuhtlalpilli is represented with turquoise around the perimeter with the fire serpents, the 2 deities, as well as the symbols. And again, the number 9 comes into play. And then finally, when you look at this monument in terms of the Zacatepolli, or the grass balls of sacrifice, bear in mind that even though they're difficult to see because the monument was shattered, I've been able to kind of basically extrapolate that there are 8 of these small basins carved into the stone all around the perimeter. And if you include the one at the center, again, the number 9 appears. And so I don't think this is a coincidence. Some might say, well, it's probably the number 8, the Franciscan number. I don't buy into that. I believe that these were being used by the priest during the new fire ceremony they would insert the bloody thorns into the grass balls. They would place the balls all around the sunstone, including the center, and then they would set them aflame as part of the new fire ceremony. Over here on the left, and you saw this earlier, there are all these markings that Anthony Avini and a host of archaeoastronomers have argued, oh, these represent constellations. I don't buy that. I believe that this is in fact where priests and others were using fire drills to ignite and torch each of the grass balls of fire, and that this was being done through the course of time beyond the original 1507 use of the sunstone. So the new fire ceremony, and I've already indicated this from the cover slide, basically entailed among the Aztecs going to a hill, and I've been to the top of that hill. It's covered, it's known as Cerro de la Estrella, Hill of the Stars, and it's literally covered with caves. In fact, I was about 17 when I jumped into one of those caves, and I swore that I saw a giant serpent rise up, and I jumped out of that cave, and my cousin and I ran all the way down the hill through fields filled with potsherds. But anyway, atop a Toltec era monument that was really a relic that had been there, the Aztecs would convene the new fire ceremony by essentially sacrificing a captive warrior, splaying open the chest, filling it with kindling, and then taking the fire drill and setting the kindling afire. And if it was successful, you would have runners come and light their torches and then begin running through the course of along the causeways to Mexico Tenochtitlan. To give you some sense of the descriptions by Boone, Ellison and Smith, Motolinia, Sahagún, and the Codex Tudela, these are quotes from them. Boone says, the most basic elements in the Aztec annals after the year count are the sequent rulers and the binding of the years or the new fire ceremony at the turn of the 52-year cycle. Elson and Smith say, the hierarchy in the distribution of the new fire followed the imperial order. The twin temples at the Templo Mayor received the first flames, then Huitzilopochtli's Calmecac, then other temples in Calmecac, then various Telpochcali, and finally individual households. So the city was literally rekindled through the sacrifice of the new fire. And Motolinia, one of the Spanish chroniclers, says, thereupon, as the fire was being blessed, waiting Indians from many towns carried new fire to their temples. They did this after asking permission from the great chief of Mexico, Motecuhzoma, the pontiff who was, as it were, their pope. They performed this with great zeal and haste. Although the place might be many leagues away, they went in such haste that in a short time they placed the fire there. In the provinces distant from Mexico, they performed the same ceremony, and it was done everywhere with much feasting and rejoicing. Sahagún says, first they put out fires everywhere in the country around, and the statues hewn in either wood or stone, kept in each man's home and regarded as gods, were all cast into the water. Also were these cast away, there was sweeping very clean, rubbish was thrown out, none lay in any of the houses. It was literally a house cleaning throughout the city. And finally, y quebraban todas las ollas y cántaros que habían servido y los comales y vasijas tenían todo lo quebraban. And they broke all of the jars and pitchers that had been used, and the cooking griddles and other vessels that they had, all were broken. So it was quite an event. It was construed as potentially the end of time, the end of the world as the Mexica Aztec knew it. One of the most inspirational images that I've seen of this recreation was when I participated in the setup of the Aztec exhibition at the Denver Museum of Natural History back in, I believe it was 1990, because I loaned a stone head, an Aztec stone head that Eduardo Matos Moctezuma validated as authentic, and it's of a decapitated Masewali or commoner. And it was the last piece as you exited the exhibit. Well, this painting was done on a massive scale. I don't know what became of it, but it shows the new fire ceremony being kindled. And you see the burning of incense, the kindling of the fire, and you see the runners running from the top of the hill to Mexico Tenochtitlan. And here we see a modern artist rendition. Unfortunately, I could not get the name from the site. They didn't credit that individual, but I thought it was worth showing, where you have the sacrifice and you see the runners running to the city. Insofar as what we actually get when we see this image, you see the dark temple of the Xiuhtlapilli. The Xiuhtlapilli was the snake woman. And this one's a depiction from the Codex Borbonicus. And during the course of my study, even though I've used the Borbonicus over and over in my teaching, it finally dawned on me, this is a codex devoted to the new fire ceremony of 1507. And so I began poring over this as I studied the Aztec Sun Stone to get at the binding of the years, the Xiuhmolpilli, as it was called, in order to interpret the new fire. And here you see the turquoise hearth. In fact, this is a term that was used by Carl Taube in an article on turquoise that he wrote some years ago. And here you literally see the turquoise hearth that signifies fire and light. And these priests, the 4 priests represented on the temple stone, are shown kindling the flames. And you see all of these priests dressed as various deities, including Xiuhtlalpilli, bearing the bundles, what we might call the Xiuhmolpilli, which is the actual bundling of the sticks. Over the right, you see people literally in fear, waiting for the world to end, and they would cover their faces with these turquoise replicas, and so as to mask their faces. And here you see in the lower left, the sacrificial captive with his chest about to be set ablaze. You might note these star patterns. They appear throughout the sunstone. They've been interpreted variously. I believe they represent the turquoise tesserae. And here we have, again, and you saw this before, I believe this mask in the British Museum signifies Xiuhtlalpilli with the welts that would accompany such an individual whose face was literally being burned by the flames, identified with this Lord. And if you go back to some of the most traditional cosmologies, for example, the Leyenda de los Mexicanos, what you get is the story of the sacrifice that occurred at Teotihuacan, in which 2 deities or 2 elite lords jump into a fire. And one of them is horribly disfigured, and he's rejected because he's not the handsome lord. The handsome lord panics and then basically cowers and steps away. In the meantime, the humble, a diseased lord jumps into the flame and gives birth to the sun. And as the sun rises into the heavens, the Lord, the vain one, who had chosen not to jump in and sacrifice himself, then jumps into the flames as well and begins to rise into the sky as a second sun, and it begins to scorch the face of the earth. And as this happens, the gods convene and realize this is going to destroy all of humanity. So one of them tosses a bowl with the impression of Xiuhtlalpilli, the rabbit, at one of the suns, the one of the vain lord, and extinguishes it, and it thereby becomes the moon. And today, if you look carefully, you will see the rabbit ears of the moon, or of the rabbit on the face of the moon. Here is a close-up of the 2 beings that, from the Codex Borbonicus, I was finally able to interpret this. The problem is they are flipped. In the Codex Borbonicus, Xiuhtlalpilli, the Lord of turquoise and fire, the avatar of kingship and emperors, is on the left. In the Borbonicus, he's on the right. And over here, paired with Xiuhtlalpilli in the Borbonicus for the new fire ceremony, is Tlahuizcalpantecutli, the planet Venus, and literally the Lord of Dawn. So while this one had never been interpreted, there'd been a lot of speculation about this deity, but if you go to the Codex Borbonicus, as I did, you will find that they are flipped. Everything is in reverse on this monument, as though to signify the underworld, this supernatural place of fright that represents the darkened, mirrored reflection of the world within which we live. Here you see, as I mentioned, the curved snout of the Xiuhtlalpilli. Here you have Xiuhtlalpilli, and then you have the mask with what appear to be a Pleiades-like constellation representing the Lord of Dawn, Tlahuizcalpantecutli. When you look at the perimeter of the Aztec Sunstone, what you get are these images. Unfortunately, my photographs of this monument didn't take this into account, so I adopted this from Bayer's work, in which we see the planet Venus undulating around the perimeter, And bear in mind, I just identified the planet Venus as constituting the deity in the mouth of the being on the right, fire serpent. And then you see these flint daggers, which are both symbols of human sacrifice or bloodletting, as well as signifying thunderbolts and the light of thunder that emanates from beings like those in the supernatural underworld. More importantly, when you look at this, you see depictions from the site of Cacaxtla, which was the centerpiece of my dissertation. And you see that it is also associated with fire. And then you see this gold nose ornament, which signifies a being that seems to replicate the planet Venus. But this is actually Itzpapalotl, the obsidian butterfly. And I'm about to get to why that becomes significant here. Here is the image from which I drew the ball court ring. You see the 4 elements which have traditionally been interpreted as signifying the 4 previous worlds prior to the 5th world. I believe that while that is in fact part of what it signifies, I believe this represents the 4 mirrors that constitute the wings of the obsidian butterfly, the goddess of war and sacrifice. She is in fact a demonic-like being who literally sweeps people up and takes them to their infernal ends. And here, I believe that was what was intended. Here we see a symbol of the Xiuhmolpilli. These are carved in stone to signify the 52 bundles or sticks that represent the passing of 52 years. These were typically buried at the base of monuments devoted to that cycle or the sun. Here you have Xiuhtlalpilli, which was the beginning of the new cycle when the famine of 1545 struck. They opted to choose the next year instead. Here we see the representation of the Xiuhtlalpilli. You see the grass ball of sacrifice. You see the thorns like those embedded in the Aztec Sun Stone, literally peering out of this. And you know, this one has agave-like blades on it. That, I might note, that monument was also created in the year of the 1507 ceremony. So here we have a constellation of monuments, all created, including, I argue, the Aztec Sun Stone in 1507 to commemorate the new fire ceremony of Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin's reign. And I might note, he was the 9th lord or emperor of the Aztec Empire. When we think of the Aztecs, we have to kind of, this was a photo that I shot when I was invited by Raul Barrera, the excavator, to come in and see one of the large skull towers that was part of the recent discovery of a skull tower. And he was aware of my work because I published a paper in 2007 in which I described this monument and its towers. And I was most intrigued by the idea that what the Spanish talked about in their description, they were horrified by this thing. They claimed that there were 100,000 human crania on this. And what they were doing was they were counting every skull as though it was part of an abacus and then multiplying it by the number of rows and columns. And they came up with figures ranging from 80,000 skewered human crania up to 135,000. And when I met Raul Barrera, there was another scholar there who literally had her iPad out. She was reading my article at the time. And she says, "Oh, so you're Mendoza." I get that a lot. And I said, "What did I do now?" And she goes, "Well, I disagree with your findings." And I said, "Well, what part of my findings?" Because there was a paper called The Divine Gourd Tree in which I reinterpreted the Aztec skull rack or the Xiuhmolpilli, and I focused on this monument. She said, "Well, you use the term gourd tree, that's Mayan." And I said, "Well, what you need to understand is these cosmologies are interlinked and oftentimes conflated. And I believe the divine gourd tree of the Popol Vuh is part of this cosmology that endured all the way through the Aztec period. And that the skull racks are armatures representing either trees or literally the Milky Way, as Xolotl, the deity of the Milky Way, is often linked to the one in Mexico City. But here you see the base of one of the skull towers, which was 7 skulls wide and included hundreds and hundreds of skewered human crania. And I was able to crawl over this ledge that you see over here with my cameras. And I literally hung precariously over this area and I shot photos down into the interior. I have a lot of photos from that day, but I just thought that I would include this to give you a sense of monuments that were linked to the Aztec Sunstone as far as their cosmology. So now we look at the incarnation of the 9th sun, Sol Nueve. And here, this is the Codex Borgia 39 and 40. And here you see Sol Nueve, who has a blackened body. He has these black tags that signify sacrifice. You see his headdress has been split open, and out of it emerges blood and light. You see that same thing here, where blood is emerging from this piece of light. Here you have another disc signifying light pouring from the body of the sun along with blood. And you have 9 beings, all represent different deities, all literally cutting into the sunstone. Another important facet of this, which becomes important when you consider where the Aztec Sunstone was actually located, in front of the, basically in front of the Templo Mayor of the Aztec, is that you see those signs, those day signs circling the entire perimeter in a sunken courtyard. And I actually found the description of this sunken courtyard in which Sol Nueve was placed and sacrificed. So this signifies the sacrifice of the sun. And again, the number 9 repeats. And so literally one could contend that the sacrifice of this stone monument was conducted by 9 priests who literally drew the blood and the fire and the light from this monument, and then it was fully consecrated. But this is Sol Nueve. So when you look at this monument, we have Xiuhtlalpilli, or Xiuhtlalpilli, the Lord of Turquoise, basically the patron of kings. You have the secondary deity, the Lord of Dawn, the planet Venus, who's also linked to, as Susan Milbrath has argued, and she's written me about this, is that she sees evidence for an eclipse in this monument. And it's linked to the planet Venus, which literally shone bright in the sky at about this time in the late 1400s. It shone bright in the sky during a solar eclipse in which everything went dark, and then the planet Venus appeared as though it was about to devour the sun. So she's absolutely convinced. Over here, you see the drill holes that I contend were part of the fire making ceremony. Here you see one of the cupules. There's another cupule here. There's another one down here. And then you see traces of them along the perimeter, what's left of them anyway. The Tzitzimime, or the Xiuhtlalpilli, as I noted earlier, the Xiuhtlalpilli, or the androgynous Itzpapalotl. Itzpapalotl was the obsidian butterfly. She was both male and female. This androgeneity exists throughout the central Mexican traditions. And I would contend, based on the book that is coming out in one of the papers I called The Harvest of Souls, I talk about how agave and its castration was the primordial root of where the idea of human heart excision came from. You're drawing the heart, the meyolotl, out of the heart of the agave plant, and then you draw its precious fluid and it gives you life. By the same token, on the other end, I talk about how human sacrificial captives, especially women, young, intermediate or middle-aged, and then elderly, are dressed as corn stalks with the imagery of the maize deity, and then they are sacrificed, they are skinned, and their skins are buried in the fields to assure an abundant harvest. Well, the Xiuhtlalpilli, or the Tzitzimime, were star demons who were believed to descend during solar eclipses, and they would devour humanity. And so this was an incredible moment of fear. And so the 52-year cycle and the ceremony was considered critical to staving off the demonic possessions entailed. I might note that in this case, while this one is identified in the National Museum as the Xiuhmolpilli, I believe it actually represents the conflated imagery of Itzpapalotl. And you note her wings extend out through here. You see the feathers here. And she is always described as having massive claws that are used to pluck humans from the planet. And here you see the flint dagger emerging from her mouth in a depiction that looks very similar to that of the so-called Tonatiuh sun deity of day. That is not the daylight sun deity. It is not Tonatiuh. It is Sol Nueve, the ninth sun. And here, and I'm about to get to a point that will explain the centrality of the monument. Itzpapalotl signifies a knife of butterflies, an obsidian butterfly. She was one of those gods who, as they affirm, were expelled from heaven. And on this account, they paint her surrounded with knives and wings of butterflies. They represent him with the feet of an eagle, because they say that she occasionally appears to them and that they only see the feet of an eagle before they are killed. I won't go into the rest of these details because I know I'm running out of time, but you also note the taxonomy of the Itzpapalotl is as a moth, Rothschildia orizaba, and she's popularly known as cuatro espejos, 4 mirrors. That's important for what I'm going to do next. Bear in mind that Itzpapalotl, I believe, is depicted on the breastplates of these warriors. I believe that Tolan and the Toltecs were essentially barefoot aristocracies who abandoned Teotihuacan during the collapse, and they emerged right on the perimeter to fight for the resurrection of Tolan Teotihuacan. Here we have another depiction of Itzpapalotl, and you see that she has almost a demonic fleshless face. She always has claws, and here you see her wings with the espejos, or the mirrors, and the blades. Here, several of the representations of the butterfly, and I've been finding this butterfly represented variously. Here you have another one, but this is the one that's at the heart of the center of the Aztec Sun Stone. Here are more depictions. The Aztecs used her in symbols of warfare. Here she's covered with obsidian blades. And then, of course, here you see a backpack with the 4 wings. And then here you have the 4 wings, again, depicted on Itzpapalotl. This is my artificial intelligence version of Itzpapalotl, and what in an AI cosmos she would look like. And so what I did, and when I did this for the people at the Southwest seminars, I told them, you're about to laugh, and I'm okay with that. But here's the AI version of the center of the Aztec Sunstone. So I believe that the 4 petals, or 4 mirrors of the obsidian butterfly, are what are depicted. These massive claws are depicted to the right and to the left. And literally, this is an incarnation, a conflation of Sol Nueve, who is a nocturnal being, a nocturnal sun, emerging from this underworld of darkness into the light as this demonic creature. And I'm getting close to the end here, and I know I've probably gone over time, but this is the massive figure of Xiuhtlalpilli that was discovered, and it was adjacent to this monument where the monument to the Xiuhmolpilli, the obsidian butterfly, was located, atop which the sunstone was once placed and then removed by the Spaniards because they saw it as a demonic being. And then finally, when we look at the legacy of the Mexica Aztec, they rose to become one of the greatest empires of the Americas, and only second to perhaps the Inca themselves. The reality was that their cosmos and their belief in these beings and the centrality of the new fire ceremony, the famine of the mid-15th century that caused a disruption of the new fire ceremony, was seen as malevolent. And oftentimes Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin is depicted as this docile, nervous little man who had all these superstitions. No, he was a great warrior. And that's been borne out by his battles among the Tlaxcalteca, where he was nearly killed on the battlefield and survived it. But he celebrated this new fire ceremony as central to his kingship as the 9th emperor of the Aztec people. And Hernan Cortez's arrival, unfortunately, came on the year 1 read, which was one of those periods that was part of the cycle of this greater new fire calibration. And I close with that image, and I can take any questions that you might like. I realize I did go over time. Do we have any questions? I know that's a lot to cover in a short period of time. But again, anybody that might want a copy of the article, I did send one, and I'm more than happy to send along copies to anybody that might be interested.
First of all, I think you did perfectly on timing, so thank you for that presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I do have a question, but I'll let somebody else talk first. Go ahead.
I have a question, and that is, what is, and it may be kind of a silly one, but what is the difference between the new fire ceremony and the old one? Because
Okay.
you pointed out both.
Yes, well, one of the things that we're looking at, you have to bear in mind that the collapse of ancient Teotihuacan, in my argument, and I do have a paper that addresses some of this, you have the collapse of Teotihuacan, and my dissertation deals with that collapse, but insofar as how Teotihuacan was ultimately expelled from the Maya region. And they shift gears, and the documentation appears to show them shifting their trade and imperial ambitions to the west and to the north right before the ultimate collapse. And we do know now that the collapse of the city occurred in 550 at the same time Maya cities where Teotihuacan dominated the dynasties, like at Tikal or Motul. In that place, everything that looked remotely Mexican or Teotihuacan was smashed and burned. So there's something very big going on. I would contend that the old fire ceremony ends at roughly 550 to 600. There are those who claim, oh, the burning of the city was a new fire ceremony that got out of hand. Well, that'd be like saying, oh yeah, well, the January 6th event was the beginning of a new fire ceremony that got out of hand. Well, I wouldn't argue that. It is clear that it was an attack on the city of Teotihuacan. The new fire ceremony that Bill Fash talks about, and that I think we have a lot of evidence for, it ends, but for many years, Signs, one of the premier Mesoamericanists, was excavating at Xochicalco, which is to the south, west of Mexico City. There, you have some of the earliest depictions of new fire symbol imagery, and he speculated that it was at that point that the new fire ceremony began, but I believe that's incorrect. I believe the new fire ceremony began with the, perhaps with the construction of the Adosada platform at roughly 250 AD, and it was attached to the so-called Pyramid of the Sun. And we have evidence that the Maya were literally leading pilgrimages to the city so that their royalty, their lords, could be invested as kings, as fireborn lords, as sun-faced lords. And we have the evidence in the form of monuments. So you have what could be construed as the old fire ceremony, and then after 600, it's rekindled. That's excuse the pun, but it's rekindled, and then it's adopted by the Tolteca, the Mixteca, the Azteca, and virtually every other group in Mesoamerica.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Rubén, how can we contact you about getting the paper that you mentioned?
Let me type in my, I retired on December 30th of 22 from the university, but I still do have my email account. We'll see for how long. So let me just type in my university account, since they have technicians who can help me clean it all up. I've got a lot of old emails still on there. Let me, yeah, there it is. So there's my email address. If you email me, I'd be happy to send you that paper. And also, I haven't posted, I haven't posted that paper out of respect to the Germans. Let's face it, they've invited me to Halle, Germany on 3 different occasions. They paid all my expenses. I published 3 papers. The Germans don't waste any time. Literally, the paper is published by the end of the year. I've never seen anything like it. One of the things in that the State Museum of Prehistory in Halle, I published a paper called Mining the Mountain of Sustenance about prestige technologies among the Olmec. I published a second paper, which was the Aztec paper. And then the third paper was called Technologies of Terror on Amerindian headhunting in the Americas. So I explain it from Mexico City. I talk about architectures of aggression and how these proliferate across the breadth of the Americas, typically centered on empires, because normally villages don't engage at this level. And in the paper on Mining the Mountain of Sustenance, what I find is you have and I don't want to ruin the Olmec for some of you, but we actually have a documentation through Mexican scholars that they recovered an area at San Lorenzo where they found there had been a massive feast, and what they were feasting on were small children that had been cooked and then eaten, and then they smashed all these fine, what could be the equivalent of porcelains, and then they piled it atop the remains of all these children that had been devoured. In a paper that I have coming out in a volume devoted to ancient violence in the Americas, I was able to again resurrect some of these older studies at Cacasla, which is this site with Maya and Central Mexican iconography. It's the center of my dissertation. Many of the mass burials there are actually of children that were either dismembered or cannibalized. And this appears to be an elite thing going on. I don't see it as widespread among the common people, but the elites were literally devouring the children of the people that they ruled over or of their enemies.
Great.
What I was going to say is you can also go to academia.edu. I haven't posted any of these recent papers, but I have a lot of other things on there. Lately, my publishers are saying, oh, you can't post these to public sites like that anymore. And so, but I guess I can still post proof copies, which don't usually have the correct pagination or other things. So I will be posting these. I've been given permission by the Germans to post them. I just held off because I wanted to see what happened in Europe in terms of how they interpreted my paper. And so,
excellent presentation. And then I was wondering, why do you call the Pyramid of the Sun the so-called Pyramid of the Sun?
I would call it that only because we don't know what the peoples of that time called it. But it's clear that at the base of the structure, we have a lot of evidence for the Xiuhtlalpilli, which is the new fire ceremony. So what could contend if we knew the language that was in play at Teotihuacan at the height of its power? I would prefer to call it that. I prefer to use indigenous terms in much the same way I prefer to use Hispanic terms. We are using English terms, and we're using translations of Spanish identifications by archaeologists, historians, art historians, and so-called. I can't pin it down, but I do find credibility in the naming of the city of Teotihuacan is Teotihuacan, place of the sun. That makes a lot of sense to me, given what has now been found at the Pyramid of the Sun. I might also note that on each of the 4 corners of every level, and we document this, it's Manuel Gamio excavated children that had been sacrificed and buried at every corner of that pyramid. So when people say, oh no, this was a peaceful society, well, that would be like calling us peaceful. I would never call us peaceful. We've been at war forever. And I would say that in many regards, many of these societies had their enemies, and they had cosmologies and beliefs and politics that led them to go up against even the most Pacific peoples who suffered the onslaught.
Yeah. And isn't there a concept of those who were sacrificed that they turned into butterflies?
Yes, yeah, you're accurate there. In fact, I live near Pacific Grove, and the butterflies come back to us every year, and they go back to Mexico. So that's kind of intriguing to me. But in effect, these are moths that represent Xiuhtlapilli with her 4 obsidian mirrors that literally she, basically mirrors the other world in blackness. Because if you go to the Postectli, the Nahua of the Sierra de Puebla, which have been studied, significantly, what you find is they believe that the only way that you can properly be introduced to your death is if you've seen a shaman and they have given you, they've kind of scribed their way into describing that underworld, which is a mirrored reflection of the plazas, the churches. Everything is a blackened, darkened mirror of everything that we live in this life. So if your life is not up to par, or if you're doing things that you shouldn't be doing in the community, you will find those demons in that underworld. And I guess getting back to your question, the butterflies, the Aztec and many other Mesoamericans believed that warriors who died on the battlefield would return shortly thereafter as these ephemeral butterflies. And so that is one dimension of that. I believe it may be linked to this notion of the Xiuhtlapilli. And I might argue, and based on identifications done, when there were a number of archaeologists, Saburo Sugiyama and others from the Mexican Institute, who excavated the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, or the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. And that building was literally torched, and the massive stone heads of the so-called feathered serpents were literally rolled onto the tops of the palaces. They found the dismembered remains of 3 elites with jade beads. And then they found a statue that had been smashed, and the remains had been spread for a distance of several hundred feet. And they believed that that was a depiction of Xiuhtlapilli, the obsidian butterfly, who may have been central to the cosmology of ancient Teotihuacan. So already we have this notion of a butterfly or a moth who is a representation of war and sacrifice at ancient Teotihuacan.
There is one question that I'll just hopefully we can get the Reader's Digest answer. It says, please define king.
King. Cacique or great speaker was typically what was used, or Tlatuani, great speaker, were the terms used by the Aztecs or Nahua to represent those individuals. By kingship, these are obviously terms from the Western tradition, but the cacique was the great speaker, the elder, or the communicator who led his people. So they were the highest authority. When the Aztecs grew to the extent that they did, the Tlatuani, or great speaker, became essentially the equivalent of an emperor. And so you have shades of high rank and status that mimic those that might be identified with kingship in the Western tradition.
Okay, I had one quick question. How as big as the sunstone is, how many people do you think it took to carve that, and how long do you think it took?
Well, what's interesting about that monument is that even the Mayanists, who have all this epigraphy available to them, typically, even in some of the most complex compositions, whether they be ceramic or stone, oftentimes they would be signed by their author or their creator, but dedicated to their king or their great lord. And so we don't have that option, except to say that on the monument in the upper left, right outside of the, if you want to call it the 4 mirrors of the obsidian butterfly, you have the name of Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin literally carved right on the monument. So we know that it definitely, it's not likely to date before 1502, but it could date as late as 1521, when the Aztec literally collapse, or 1520, I should say, when Moctezuma meets his end. Oh, and then finally, the semasiography of the monument, and if you look at the artistic, the sculptural design and characteristics, it almost looks like it was done by a master craftsman, perhaps with the assistance. Even Diego Rivera didn't paint the murals all by himself, but there is a continuity, a consistency, because he trained his subordinates to paint the murals in the styles that were significant to his overall design. So I believe that there was a master craftsman who laid out the design, and then there were a number of others who were part of that tradition or training, who then elaborated it into stone. Because if you're working for Motecuhzoma Xocoyotzin, you do not want to be late for the new fire ceremony. You'd end up on the Xiuhmolpilli.
Well, thank you so very much. I'm going to be sending your certificate of appreciation for tonight's talk. I'll get that out. And I just want to make note of next month's presentation. It's going to be by Dr. Ben Potter. He's going to be speaking to us from the University of Alaska. And I got in touch with him when I saw an article that he was working with on the burial of the Beringia child. So he's going to be speaking to us March 14th. Hopefully everybody can join us.
Joe,
yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt, but I noticed there's another question here.
Oh.
Yes, it says, you spoke briefly on David Stewart's King and Cosmos. What are your thoughts specifically on his interpretation at the center of the Aztec Sun Stone as a deified portrait of Moctezuma II in the guise of Xiuhtlapilli? Well, actually, I recently came across I don't know if this was a professor, but he was rather articulate. He was clearly identified with his Chicano heritage, but he made an interesting point about the element over the head of the central being and below, and the claws. He argues that it represents an eagle or possibly a butterfly. And in David Stewart's booklet, one of his central acknowledgments is he believes that the being at the center represents Moctezuma, and I do believe that. But you have to bear in mind that I use the term multivalent. Every symbol, every depiction has multiple manifestations, and they're androgynous. So you have multiple levels. The agave is androgynous. It's an androgynous plant. The maize cornstalk is androgynous. It literally fertilizes itself. And all of these things are clearly part of the cosmology and iconography. So I have no problems with that being Moctezuma, that being Sol Nueve, because he was the 9th son. Moctezuma was the 9th lord, and Xiuhtlapilli was the goddess or god of the underworld of 9 levels. So there's a conflation, numerology. And so I'm in accord with that. But I think the critique of Central Mexicans and their interpretation of the monument is a little out of focus, because he's not considering the long history of the use of Nahuatl to interpret those monuments. There's a lot of great scholars who have, and I, again, didn't mean to interrupt, but we did have the question, and I did want to respond.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for coming. Dr. Mendoza, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
A lot of good information. Hope everybody has a good evening. Happy belated Groundhog's Day to everybody. And I hope you can have a good ride home. Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good night, everybody. Dr. Mendoza, thank you very much. Good job.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate it.
And a quick shout out to Artie. Thank you very much for your help today. We got in the room just fine, as you can see.